The cold had a way of settling into a man's bones, deeper than just the skin, deeper than anything a thick coat or a cab heater could fix. It was the kind of winter morning that made the world feel empty, like everything had gone quiet under the weight of the snow. Frank Dawson had spent his life on the road, but he had never gotten used to mornings like this. The kind where the fog was thick and the frost clung to the trees like ghosts. His hands, calloused from decades of gripping the steering wheel, flexed instinctively as he adjusted his hold. The heater in his rig hummed low, barely making a dent in the chill that lingered in the air. It was just another day, another haul, another stretch of highway rolling endlessly under the tires of his Peterbilt. But something about this morning gnawed at him, something in the silence that felt heavier than usual. He had driven through fog before, seen snow pile up on the sides of the road like silent sentinels, but this was different. Maybe it was the way the world outside seemed frozen in time. Maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't want to name. Margaret would have called it God's hour. She used to say that about early mornings like these, back when she was still here, still sitting beside him with a thermos of coffee and that soft smile that had never faded from his memory. Mornings like these are when the world is waiting for something beautiful to happen, she used to say. Frank had stopped believing in that kind of thing a long time ago. The clock on the dashboard read 6:14 a.m. His deadline was tight. He had a delivery to make in Portland, and he knew better than anyone that trucking companies didn't care about excuses. But then he saw it. At first, it was nothing but a shadow on the edge of the road, just barely visible through the swirling mist. Probably a pile of trash, maybe an old piece of furniture someone had abandoned. He'd seen plenty of things left out in the cold before. But as he got closer, the headlights cut through the fog, and suddenly, it wasn't trash at all. It was a dog. A golden retriever mix, curled up in the snow, her body trembling against the wind. Frank's grip on the wheel tightened. Damn, he muttered under his breath, eyes flicking toward the clock again. He should keep driving. He knew that. But something about the way she was curled, the way her thin body shielded something in the snow, made his gut twist. He leaned forward, trying to see clearer. There, nestled against her belly, were 4 tiny shapes. Puppies. Barely moving. Barely alive. Frank cursed, his foot hesitating over the gas pedal. This wasn't his problem. He was already behind schedule. He had places to be, deadlines to meet. The truck rumbled past, and for a brief moment, he told himself it wasn't his business. But then, in the side mirror, he caught one last glimpse of them, the mother dog lifting her head, her eyes following him, her body shaking but unmoving, refusing to leave her pups. And suddenly, he could hear Margaret's voice again, soft and familiar, like she was sitting right beside him. Sometimes, angels appear in the places you least expect. Frank let out a slow breath, staring at the empty road ahead. This was a mistake. He knew it before he even touched the brakes. But that didn't stop him. With a heavy sigh, he slowed the truck, pulling over onto the shoulder. The engine groaned in protest as he shifted into neutral. The fog swallowed him as he stepped out, the cold cutting through his coat in an instant. His boots crunched against the packed snow as he made his way toward the shivering forms on the roadside. The mother dog lifted her head again as he approached, her eyes weary, exhausted. She didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She just watched him, waiting. Frank knelt in the snow, his breath fogging in the freezing air. "Hey there, girl," he murmured, his voice softer than he expected. "What the hell are you doing out here?" She didn't answer, of course. But when he reached out a gloved hand, she didn't flinch. Frank exhaled slowly, his chest tightening in a way he wasn't ready to name. He had a choice to make. He could get back in the truck, turn the heater up, and keep driving like he never saw them. Or he could do something stupid. Something that would put him behind schedule. Something that might just change everything. The wind howled through the trees, and the puppies whimpered in the cold. Frank sighed. "God damn it," he muttered. And then, without another word, he reached down and picked up the first tiny, shivering pup. Frank Dawson was no saint. He had spent most of his years looking out for himself, never stopping long enough to let anything, or anyone, slow him down. But as he crouched in the snow, staring at the trembling golden retriever and her 4 fragile pups, he knew he couldn't just walk away. The mother dog's eyes stayed locked on him, wary but exhausted. She had no fight left in her, he could see that. She wasn't protecting herself anymore, she was protecting them. Frank sighed, shaking his head. "You sure picked the worst damn place to get stranded, girl." His fingers were stiff in the cold as he reached out, slow and careful. She didn't flinch when he touched her, didn't snarl or back away. If anything, she seemed relieved, like she had been waiting for someone to stop. Frank felt something heavy settle in his chest. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him like that. He turned his attention to the puppies, tiny things barely the size of his palm. Their fur was matted with frost, their breath slow and uneven. One of them wasn't moving. "Damn it," Frank muttered, quickly shrugging off his heavy flannel coat. He bundled the puppies inside, pressing them close to his chest as he stood. The heat of his body was their only chance now, and even then, he wasn't sure if it would be enough. The mother dog let out a soft whine, shifting her weight as if to follow. But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Frank cursed. She was weaker than he thought. "You're not gonna make me carry you, are you?" he asked, glancing down at the barely conscious dog. She didn't respond. Frank sighed, adjusting his grip on the jacket full of puppies. "This is a bad idea," he muttered to himself. "A really bad idea." But that didn't stop him from doing it. He bent down, sliding one arm under the mother dog's body, the other cradling the puppies close. She was lighter than she should have been, bones pressing against thin fur, her body trembling violently from the cold. Frank tightened his grip. "All right, girl. Let's get you out of here." The walk back to the truck was slow, every step careful on the ice-covered ground. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the weight in his arms, the mother dog's shallow breaths, the weak squirm of the puppies against his chest. When he reached the truck, he wrestled the door open with his elbow and gently laid them on the passenger seat. The cab was already warm, the heater blowing full blast. It wasn't much, but it was something. The mother dog let out a tired sigh as she curled around her pups, pressing them close for whatever warmth she could offer. Frank watched them for a moment, then reached for the old wool blanket he kept behind the seat. He spread it over them carefully, tucking the edges around their tiny bodies. "There," he said softly. "Better?" The mother dog blinked up at him, her amber eyes glassy but grateful. Frank swallowed against the lump in his throat. "You're welcome," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "God help me." He climbed back into the driver's seat, fingers flexing around the wheel as he stared at the empty road ahead. He had wasted too much time already. He needed to get moving, needed to make his delivery if he had any hope of keeping his job. And yet, he glanced over at the mother dog again. Her ribs were visible beneath her fur, her breathing shallow. She wasn't going to make it much longer without real help. Frank exhaled slowly. "Guess we're making a detour," he murmured, shifting into gear. The truck rumbled to life beneath him, the tires crunching over ice as he eased back onto the road. For the first few miles, he drove in silence, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The last thing he needed was to get attached. He had spent years on the road, never staying in one place for too long. But something about the way the mother dog curled around her puppies, the way she had trusted him so easily, made it impossible to ignore. He sighed, reaching for the thermos of coffee in his cup holder. "You're lucky I'm an idiot," he muttered, taking a slow sip. Beside him, the mother dog let out a contented sigh, resting her head on the seat. Frank shook his head. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. The hum of the truck's engine filled the cab, steady and reassuring against the howling wind outside. Snow flurries whipped past the windshield, swirling in erratic patterns before vanishing into the darkness. Frank kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the thermos of coffee he hadn't touched in over an hour. His mind, however, was anywhere but on the road. The mother dog, Grace, he decided to call her, was curled up on the seat beside him, her thin frame wrapped protectively around her pups. Every so often, he'd hear the faintest sound from them, soft whimpers, tiny breaths, proof of life. Proof that they were still holding on. Frank sighed, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. "You know," he muttered, glancing over at them, "you remind me of someone." Grace didn't move, but her ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. "Margaret," he said, his tone softer than before. "My wife, she was the one who had the heart for this kind of thing." He exhaled through his nose, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "She once pulled over in the middle of a thunderstorm to save a stray dog. Didn't even hesitate. Just jumped out of the car like a damn fool, soaking wet, and carried the poor thing right into the front seat." The memory settled in his chest like an old photograph pulled from a dusty album. He could still see her, hair plastered to her face, rain dripping from the hem of her coat, cradling the trembling mutt in her arms like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Some things are worth stopping for," she had told him that night. Frank swallowed hard. She had always been the one to see the good in things. He had been the practical one, the one who thought about the how and the why. But Margaret, she never needed a reason. If something needed saving, she saved it. And now here he was, doing the same damn thing. Frank shook his head, eyes flicking toward the road ahead. The snow had picked up, thickening with each passing mile. The visibility was getting worse. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing streaks of ice across the windshield. "Just my luck," he muttered under his breath. He gripped the wheel a little tighter. The road signs had already disappeared into the storm, leaving nothing but an endless expanse of white in every direction. The truck's headlights barely cut through the darkness. Frank's pulse quickened. He had driven in bad conditions before, but this was something else entirely. A soft whimper from Grace pulled his attention back to the cab. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the dim dashboard lights. She knew. Somehow, she knew something wasn't right. "Easy, girl," Frank murmured. "We're fine." It was a lie. His hands were clammy against the wheel, his gut twisting with unease. He needed to make a decision, fast. He scanned the road, searching for anything, a rest stop, a gas station, a damn diner with a neon open sign flickering in the storm. But there was nothing. Nothing but snow and silence. The pups let out another small cry, their bodies pressed tightly against their mothers for warmth. Frank cursed under his breath. He wasn't just responsible for himself anymore. He had them now. With a sharp exhale, he made his choice. He eased off the gas and turned onto the next exit, barely visible under the blanket of snow. The truck groaned in protest as the tires fought for traction, sliding slightly before gripping onto the frozen road. Frank's heart pounded. He wasn't even sure where this road led, just that it had to lead somewhere. Minutes passed. Maybe more. The storm thickened. Then, lights. Faint at first, barely visible through the snowfall. But as he got closer, they sharpened into something familiar, a small roadside motel, its old-fashioned vacancy sign buzzing weakly in the storm. Relief washed over him like a wave. Frank pulled into the lot, the truck's tires crunching over the ice. The engine rumbled as he shifted into park, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Grace lifted her head again, her eyes questioning. Frank smirked, reaching over to scratch behind her ears. "Guess Margaret was right," he murmured. "Some things are worth stopping for." And with that, he opened the door and stepped into the storm, ready to save them, and maybe, just maybe, ready to save himself too. Frank sat in his truck, staring at the dimly lit buildings of the small town he had stumbled into. The snowstorm still raged behind him, but here, beneath the flickering glow of streetlights, the world seemed quieter. More still. His eyes scanned the storefronts lining the main road, a diner with a neon sign that read closed, a gas station with its lights off, and a darkened hardware store. Then, just past the gas station, he saw it. A small, weathered sign, barely legible beneath a layer of frost. Parker's Veterinary Clinic. Frank let out a breath. Bingo! Beside him, the mother dog, Grace, lifted her head, her tired eyes watching him with silent trust. Her pups were curled against her, barely moving under the warmth of the old wool blanket. "Hang on, girl," Frank murmured, reaching for the door handle. "Let's get you some help." A knock in the night. The clinic was dark, its large front window covered by heavy blinds. A small porch light flickered weakly above the entrance, casting long shadows against the snow-covered ground. Frank knocked, his knuckles rapping against the wooden door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Frank sighed, his breath curling in the freezing air. "Come on, Doc. Somebody's gotta be in there." He was about to turn back when he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then, the faint click of a deadbolt unlocking. The door creaked open just a few inches, revealing a woman, mid-60s, gray hair tied back in a loose bun, eyes sharp and assessing. She wore a thick cardigan over scrubs, and in her hand was a flashlight, aimed directly at Frank's face. "We're closed," she said, her voice low and tired. "Come back in the morning." Frank raised his hands, palms up. "Look, I wouldn't be knocking if it wasn't urgent." She squinted at him, then flicked the flashlight downward. The beam landed on the bundle in his arms. Grace. The pups. The exhaustion on the woman's face shifted, just slightly, into something else. Concern. She exhaled through her nose, then muttered, "Bring them in." She pushed the door open, motioning him inside. Frank didn't hesitate. The assessment. The clinic was small, smelling faintly of antiseptic and old wood. The waiting area had a few worn chairs, a desk cluttered with paperwork, and an old radio playing soft country music in the background. Dr. Ellen Parker led him through a doorway into a back room, where a stainless steel examination table sat under the glow of a fluorescent light. Frank gently set the mother dog down, unwrapping the blanket to reveal her pups. Dr. Parker pulled on a pair of gloves. "How long have they been out there?" "Couldn't say," Frank admitted. "Found them on the side of the road. Guessing someone dumped them." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she pressed her fingers lightly against the mother dog's ribs. Her frown deepened. "She's severely underweight. Probably been struggling to feed them for weeks." Grace didn't flinch under her touch, but she did let out a tired sigh, as if she knew she was finally somewhere safe. Dr. Parker reached for a stethoscope, listening to her heartbeat. "It's weak," she murmured, "but steady." She turned her attention to the puppies, peeling back the blanket to examine them one by one. The smallest of the litter didn't move at all. Frank felt his stomach tighten. Dr. Parker pressed a hand gently to its tiny body, her brow furrowing. Then, after a long pause, she let out a slow breath. "This one's barely hanging on." She moved quickly, grabbing a heating pad and a small dropper from a cabinet. "They're all dehydrated, near hypothermia. We'll need to warm them up slowly, can't do it too fast, or it'll send them into shock." Frank nodded, feeling a little useless as he watched her work. Grace let out a low whimper as Dr. Parker lifted one of the pups. "She's a good mother," the vet observed. "Been giving them everything she has." Frank swallowed. Yeah. He had seen that kind of devotion before. Margaret had been the same way. Always putting others first. Always willing to give everything, even when it cost her. Frank cleared his throat. "She gonna make it?" Dr. Parker hesitated before answering. "She's tough. If we can get some fluids in her, some food in her system, she's got a chance." She reached for an N4 bag, hooking it onto a nearby stand. But the pups, well, they're a different story. Frank exhaled through his nose. "Figures." Dr. Parker glanced at him. "You a trucker?" "Yeah." She nodded toward his coat, still dusted with snow. "And yet, here you are in the middle of the night, saving a stray and her litter." Frank shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of her words. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure why he had stopped. But now, standing in this small-town clinic, watching this woman fight to keep these dogs alive, he realized he cared. More than he should. Dr. Parker turned back to her work. "You got somewhere to be?" Frank thought about the road. About Portland. About the job waiting for him. Then he looked at Grace. At the way her tired eyes followed his movements. At the fragile rise and fall of her pups' tiny chests. He let out a breath. Not anymore. Frank leaned against the counter of the small veterinary clinic, watching as Dr. Ellen Parker worked quickly but carefully. The old vet moved with the kind of confidence that only came from years of doing this, helping the helpless, fixing what had been broken. The room smelled of antiseptic and something warm, like coffee that had been sitting out too long. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above them, casting sharp shadows over the examination table where Grace lay, her ribs pressing against her golden fur. Dr. Parker pressed her stethoscope to Grace's chest, listening in silence before shaking her head. "She's malnourished. Badly." Frank crossed his arms. "She gonna make it?" The vet sighed. "I don't know. She's weak, and she's been giving whatever she had left to keep those pups alive." She lifted one of the small bodies, barely larger than her palm, and pressed her fingers against its tiny ribs. Frank swallowed hard. The pup didn't even move. "They're ice cold," Dr. Parker murmured. "Dehydrated, near hypothermic. If you hadn't found them when you did, she trailed off, shaking her head before reaching for a small dropper. Frank didn't need her to finish the sentence. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the old floorboards creaking under his boots. The storm outside still howled, snow piling up against the windows, as if trying to bury the little clinic in silence. Dr. Parker glanced at him. How long were they out there? Frank exhaled through his nose. No idea. Found them curled up in the snow off the highway. The vet made a quiet sound in the back of her throat, something between frustration and understanding. Some people shouldn't be allowed to have dogs, she muttered, adjusting the force she had hooked up to Grace. Frank couldn't argue with that. He looked down at Grace, her body barely rising and falling with each breath, then back at the pups. The smallest one still hadn't moved. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. Damn it. He wasn't supposed to care this much. Dr. Parker must have seen something in his face because she let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders. Look, she said, I can keep them here overnight, make sure they're stable. But after that, they'll need more care. There's a good shelter about 30 miles from here. I can call in the morning in. No. The word came out before Frank had even thought about it. Dr. Parker paused, raising an eyebrow. No? Frank ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He wasn't sure where the hell that had come from, but now that it was out there, he realized he meant it. You drop Em off at a shelter, what happens next? He asked. Dr. Parker studied him for a long moment before answering. They'll do their best. But a mother dog this week? Pups this small? There's no guarantee. If no one fosters them quickly, they'll be separated. The shelter's overcrowded as it is. Frank clenched his jaw. He had seen enough things in his life to know what that meant. A long silence settled between them. The radio in the corner played something low and mournful, barely more than a whisper under the sound of the storm. Dr. Parker leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms. What are you saying, Frank? Frank sighed. I'm saying, I can't just walk away. Dr. Parker tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words. Then she let out a small, knowing smile. I figured as much. She turned back to the mother dog, gently stroking her head. Looks like you've got yourself a family, trucker. Frank let out a short laugh, shaking his head. God help me. But as he looked at Grace, at the tiny lives curled up beside her, he felt something settle in his chest, something steady, something right. Maybe this wasn't just about saving them. Maybe, just maybe, it was about saving himself, too. The truck's engine hummed softly in the quiet of the night, the heat from the vents filling the cab with a comforting warmth. Outside, the snowstorm had finally begun to die down, leaving behind thick drifts piled high along the edges of the small-town streets. The veterinary clinic was dark now, save for a dim porch light flickering in the cold, but Frank could still feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had told Dr. Parker he wasn't going to leave the dogs at the shelter. Beyond that, though, he had no damn idea what he was doing. Frank leaned back against the seat, rubbing his hands over his face. His body ached from the long day, from the stress, from the weight of something he hadn't carried in a long time, responsibility. Not for a job. Not for a delivery. For something alive. He glanced down at the passenger seat. Grace had settled in beside him, her body curled up tight, her head resting against his leg. She was still weak, still too thin, but for the first time since he had found her in the snow, she looked at peace. Frank exhaled, his chest tightening in a way he wasn't ready to name. "Guess you're stuck with me for now," he murmured. Grace let out a slow breath, her warm exhale brushing against his knee. A silent thank you. Frank reached down, resting a hand lightly on her head. Her fur was coarse, weathered by weeks, maybe months, of struggle. He scratched gently behind her ears, and for the first time, he felt her body relax completely. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. But maybe, just maybe, that didn't matter. Frank wasn't sure how long he had slept, but when he woke, the cab was filled with the soft whimpers of the puppies. They were hungry. For a brief moment, panic flickered through him. He had no idea how to care for newborn pups. Margaret had always been the one who knew these things. But Margaret wasn't here. Frank sat up, careful not to disturb Grace, and reached for the box Dr. Parker had given him before she locked up for the night. Inside were 4 small bottles, each filled with a mix of warm milk and nutrients, everything the pups needed to survive. He studied them, feeling ridiculous. "All right, kids," he muttered. "Let's see if we can figure this out." The first pup, the smallest one, the one Dr. Parker had been worried about, barely stirred as he picked it up. It was light, too light, its tiny ribs pressing against his fingers. Frank swallowed. "Come on, kid. Stay with me." He held the bottle to its mouth, squeezing the nipple lightly, watching as a few drops landed against its tongue. Nothing. Frank's chest tightened. "Come on, buddy," he whispered, adjusting the angle. He had seen Margaret do this before, hold them close, keep them warm. He did the same, pressing the pup gently against his chest, rubbing its back with careful strokes. Another drop. Then, a tiny suckle. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "There you go," he murmured. "That's it." It was slow, but the pup kept drinking, growing stronger with each tiny pull. By the time he was done, Frank realized something strange. He was smiling. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt needed. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the town covered in a thick white blanket. Frank sat in the small office of the veterinary clinic, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Across from him, Dr. Parker was watching him with quiet amusement. "You did all right," she said. Frank huffed. "I didn't drop any, if that's what you mean." Dr. Parker smirked, sipping from her own mug. "That's a start." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "So," she said after a pause, "what do you want to do with them?" Frank stared down at the coffee in his hands. The easy answer would have been to say he didn't know. That this was just temporary. That he'd figure something out. But the truth was, he wasn't sure he could let them go. The pups. Grace. This whole damn mess. Something about it felt right. Frank let out a slow breath. "I guess I'll figure that out when I get there," he said. Dr. Parker nodded, her gaze softening. "That's how it starts," she murmured. Frank glanced up. "How it starts?" She smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that carried weight behind it. Finding something worth staying for. And for the first time in years, Frank wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had. The weight of the decision pressed on Frank's chest as he sat behind the wheel of his truck, staring at the road stretching ahead. The highway was clear now, the storm having passed, leaving behind crisp, white snow that glowed under the early morning sun. He should have felt relieved, should have been ready to get moving, to make up for lost time. But he wasn't. The veterinary clinic was just behind him, a small building nestled against the quiet town. but it felt like a dividing line in his life, before this moment and after. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. Frank didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. His dispatcher. His boss. The job waiting for him. He ran a hand through his graying hair, exhaling slowly. If he didn't get back on the road soon, he'd miss the Portland delivery. That wasn't just one late shipment, it was a mark against him, a risk to his reliability, his paycheck, his reputation. His whole life had been built on showing up, on moving forward, never stopping too long. But when he glanced over at the passenger seat, he saw something that made his stomach twist. Grace. The mother dog was curled up again, her body still weak but more at ease now, her head resting against the blanket. Her puppies nestled close, their tiny bodies pressed against her belly, warm and safe for the first time in who knew how long. Frank swallowed hard. How the hell was he supposed to just walk away from this? He rubbed his face, staring out the windshield. The road was waiting. His life, the one he had built, the one that had made sense, was waiting. But for the first time in a long, long time. It didn't feel like enough. Frank leaned back in his seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He let his eyes drift shut, and before he could stop himself, the past came rushing in. Margaret. She had been sitting across from him at the kitchen table that night, the sound of the rain tapping softly against the window. The smell of her favorite chamomile tea filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of the lavender candle she always lit before bed. She had looked at him then, really looked at him, with that knowing expression, the one that always made him feel like she could see right through him. "You know what I worry about?" she had asked, her voice soft but steady. Frank had smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "That I'm gonna forget to take the trash out?" Margaret rolled her eyes, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I worry," she said, "that when I'm gone, you won't let yourself find something to hold on to." Frank's throat tightened as he remembered the way she had reached across the table then, taking his hand in hers. "You don't have to be alone, Frank," she had whispered. "You don't have to run from life." The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. Had he been running all this time? From the empty house, from the loneliness, from the feeling that without her, there wasn't anything left worth stopping for? Frank opened his eyes. The cab of the truck was silent except for the soft sound of the puppy's breathing. The road was still there, waiting. But so was this. This tiny, fragile moment of warmth and life and second chances. And for the first time, he let himself wonder, what if Margaret had been right? Frank reached over and gently stroked Grace's head. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, just let out a small sigh, like she knew she was safe now. His chest tightened. The job, the deadlines, the life he had spent decades building, none of it felt as important as what was right in front of him. Frank had spent years convincing himself that moving forward was the only way to survive. That if he just kept driving, just kept going, he wouldn't have to stop long enough to feel the weight of everything he had lost. But now he wondered if maybe he had been going in the wrong direction all along. He glanced at his phone, still buzzing with incoming messages. Then, without hesitating, he reached out and turned it off. The road would still be there tomorrow. But this moment, these lives, they needed him now. Frank exhaled slowly, his decision settling deep in his bones. For the first time in years, he wasn't choosing the road. He was choosing them. The world had changed, or maybe Frank had. Snow fell softly, blanketing the fields in quiet stillness. The wind whispered through the trees, but it didn't carry the same loneliness it once did. It wasn't empty now. It wasn't something to escape. Frank sat on the worn wooden porch of his cabin, Grace at his feet, Maggie curled up beside him. The little golden pup had grown in the past few months, her legs stronger, her coat thick and warm, her spirit as lively as ever. She wasn't the fragile thing she had once been. Neither was he. Frank took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest as he gazed out at the road ahead. For years, he had watched roads like this pass him by, mile after mile, town after town. The highway had always been a symbol of where he was going, but now he watched not for what was ahead, but for what was right here. The snow continued to fall, dusting Grace's golden fur, catching in Maggie's whiskers as she twitched in her sleep. Frank reached down, running a hand gently over her small back. A memory flickered, Margaret, laughing in the rain, cradling a stray in her arms. Frank smiled. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. He glanced down at the two dogs beside him, warmth filling the spaces in his heart that had been empty for too long. Even in a snowstorm. And for the first time in years, Frank Dawson wasn't looking for the road ahead. He was already home.